You have a lot of control over your ability to build wealth. And with these choices in your control, racism cannot take those choices or control away from you. What you need to do, spend less, save more, invest wisely. These are all choices within your control. Just choose wisely. Hello again. Welcome to The Ruthless Truth. I am your host, Truth Davis. And in this forum, I'll discuss a wide range of topics, offer opinions, truths, based on what I consider to be a unique life experience. And you can read the details of that in the bio or in the notes. General format is I will share some thoughts or observations on some current things in the news. Spend the majority of the time going into a deep discussion, which is, today's truth, and then finish with a fun American history fact. Now, that said, given the depth and length of today's truth, there may not be time available for the fun American history fact. If there is, I'll add it, but, there's a good chance that won't be in today's episode. Okay, so I generally don't talk about sports and politics, like I said, because you can get that anywhere. But, one of the biggest things in the news this week has to do with the passing of the president's signature legislature, which he signed on July 4th. And I really don't see this as discussing politics. This is discussing economics. This is discussing American life impact. And that's, how I would frame this discussion. Because this bill will significantly impact American life in many aspects for many years, if not for a generation. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you have not read the 900 pages. Hell, the senators and congressmen who signed it admit they haven't read the 900 pages. But while I haven't read all of it, I've looked into it enough to form some opinions and share some observations. So first, let me say this. There's some really good things in this bill. There's some positive things that are going to, improve the life of many Americans. All right. Now, there are other elements of it that are hotly debated. There are great disagreements about it. And you'll hear a lot about that over time, with some people seeing it as potentially disastrous. Don't know if I go that far, but I will say this. For the things that are good, they're probably not as good as they're being portrayed to be. And for the things that aren't so good, it's probably not as scary as they're being portrayed. I'll give you a couple examples of the good ones. So one of the provisions is that there will be no taxes on tips, that might be earned like by a waiter or a barber, which is great. But that provision caps the tax exemption at the first $25,000 of income. After $25,000, then tips will be taxed as ordinary income. There's also a provision that will allow people for their car loan interest payments, to deduct that interest, to make that tax deductible up to $10,000. However, it only applies to cars that were manufactured in the United States. Now, on the not so good part, there are significant cuts to some pretty major programs that often support lower income Americans, such as Medicaid, SNAP, Section 8 housing. But it's still unknown to what degree and how many people will be affected and when. But I will say this, you're going to hear a lot about this between now and the midterm elections, which will be held in November 2026. The rhetoric is going to be outrageous. It's going to be overwhelming. And all I would say is, if you care about it, or if you're worried about it, then take some time to invest in getting information from good, reliable, objective sources so you can kind of form your own opinions and how this may or may not affect you going forward. Okay, let's get to today's truth. Okay, today's truth. I want to talk about the racial wealth gap in this country. And there is a significant wealth gap between black and white households in the United States. There's always been a significant wealth gap. Now, the good news is the household income, black household income has been increasing and household net worth has been increasing for years. The bad news is that increase is not as fast as white households and other households. So even though black households are increasing net worth, the gap is actually widening. Let me just do some quick numbers for you. In 2022, the median household wealth for black households was about $44,000. For white households, the median household net worth was $285,000, which is 6.5 times more. You know, in episode 5, I talked about millionaires and the distribution and composition of those millionaires. And so I won't go over all of that here, but just one real brief summary point about millionaires in this country. Celebrities, athletes, lottery winners, they account for about 2% of all the millionaires in the United States. And if you're thinking a lot of the people are inherited, if you look at those millionaires who received at least $1 million in inheritance, they only represent 3% of the millionaires. So that's 5% of the millionaires, which is the things you hear in the practice, but that is not the typical millionaire. As I said before, most wealth is generated by people working hard, experiencing some modest increases in income over time, saving and investing wisely. That is how wealth is built in this country. Now, to the aspect of racism. Let me acknowledge this. Historical and institutional racism have been true and legitimate barriers to black wealth. There's no doubt about it, okay? Black Americans have faced countless barriers on the road to building wealth, from lower wages to decades of discriminating hiring practices and lending practices, and also to a lower level of financial literacy, okay? So racism is very real, and it's also never going away. So unless you are a straight, white, Christian male, there are some aspects about the system that are going to work against you to some degree. Okay? And I will never dismiss that. But that said, while I acknowledge it, I also say you just have to accept it and work through it. I mean, it's just a fact of life, and that can't be the only thing holding you back. And the reason I know this, because if it was all about racism, then why aren't all white people rich? Okay? So why don't we focus on the areas that we can control? And you truly have a lot of control of the key elements of wealth building, which is spending, saving, family planning, and investment strategy. Okay, let's first start talking about spending. Spending is by far the most important factor and the most controllable factor. Racism doesn't make you spend money. These are totally your choices. And you'll often hear me say, what is life made of? Life is made of time and choices. So I tell people all the time, make good choices and don't waste time. So choices. First of all, as a group, black people are the greatest spenders in America. Now, I will concede some of our spend mentality is a result of decades of being denied full access to all goods and services, and especially some high-end brands. Okay. But there are certain product categories where black people greatly over-index in spending versus the general population. And those categories in order are hair care, personal hygiene, fragrances, and soap and bath needs. Now, it's possible that this is a remnant or overcompensation for decades of being told or characterized as being dirty. Okay, so the first key to building wealth is living below your means. And to do this, you got to first know what your means is, okay? You should start by listing your monthly household expenses. Take some time and write them down. You know, in part of the financial planning process, one of the things that people are asked is to estimate what they think their monthly expenses are. And then after they give a top of the head estimate, then they go through an exercise of actually writing them down. And quite often people underestimate their expenses by more than 20%. So you really don't know what you're spending till you take the time to really write it down. We gotta stop spending to impress. You know, as a group, we often spend money we don't have on things we don't need to impress people we don't know or even like. I remember an instance once, one of my coworkers was sharing pictures from a birthday party for her nephew, and she was showing the pictures, and I looked down and I noticed the kid had on Gucci sneakers, and he's a 3-year-old. And I said to her, how much did your sister pay for these sneakers? She's like, $400. Like $400 for kids' shoes that he's going to outgrow in 6 months or less? That's crazy. Okay. And she's like, well, she wants her baby to look good. Really? At what price? You know, I'll often hear parents say, I want my kids to have everything that I didn't have. All right. That's ridiculous. First of all, you can't revisit and relive your childhood through your kids. All right. So that's happened. That train has passed. Secondly, kids are going to always ask for everything. It's okay to say no. Part of being a parent is saying no. What can they do if you do say no? Okay, they might ask why. Well, why can't I have this? Why can't I have that? Well, I'll tell you what, when I was growing up, parents ended this conversation very quickly and simply with an expression, because I said so. And that was the end of it. All right? Some people say they spend money because they don't want it to look like they can't afford some things. They're concerned about looking poor. You know what? It's a lot better to look poor than to actually be poor. If you can't afford it, you can't afford it. And even if you can afford it, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to spend it. I recall a time when my son was very young, and my father-in-law said to me, you know, you have a parenting challenge that no one related to you has experienced or can help you with. You know, you have to raise children of privilege. And he was right. I mean, it's a lot easier to say no to kids when they want something when you can honestly say, we don't have the money and we can't afford it. It takes another degree of discipline to say no and, you know, not give your kids what they ask for when you know you can afford it. And even if they know they can afford it. You know, I've never hit or spanked my kids ever. You know, even when they were kids, when they were toddlers. And the reason, and there were a couple of reasons for it. One, I think it's ineffective because I know when I was a kid, I used to get whippings all the time and it never changed my behavior. That just was part of my calculation of what I wanted to do. And if I get caught, I got a whipping, so what? I didn't care. And then secondly, I kind of struggled with, you know, let me kick your ass for a few minutes and then say how much I love you. But that was just me. All right. So while I never did, the closest I came, though, was when my oldest son was a junior in high school. And he comes to me and he says, hey, Dad, are you going to buy me a new car? A new car? I'm like, hell no, I'm not buying you a new car. You're going to drive that 7-year-old Jeep that's out in the driveway. And 2 years from now, your brother is going to be driving a 9-year-old Jeep. And then he says, you could afford to buy me a car. What? I almost lost it. I'm like, first of all, don't ever spend time counting other people's money, especially my money. Okay. And secondly, you know, you don't deserve to have a new car. And then he says, well, a lot of my friends and classmates are getting new cars, which was true. A lot of his classmates, their parents were buying them luxury and new sports cars. But what I said to him was, well, unfortunately for you, you have me as a parent. So then he said, well, damn, can you at least trick it out for me? And I thought about it for a while and I smiled. I said, yeah, I'll check it out for you. So we did put in like a banging sound system. And the Jeep was already black and he was fine with it. He enjoyed it. So there's 2 points I'm making with this example. First, your kids will have to accept and live with that, whatever decision you make. And they get over things quickly. They'll blow things up for a while. They'll be upset, but they get over things quickly. Second, you're the parent. Your kids really should have no vote in household money management decisions. And finally, how will they ever learn the value of things? Okay. If they never have to save for it or wait for it or work for it, we need to teach and instill these values, because that's where spending mentality starts. You know, kids learning from their parents who learned it from their parents. Okay. A little bit more about spending. If you are unable to pay your credit card balance off at the end of every month, then you're spending too much money. You know, we have to get to the point that we can normalize delayed gratification. I see people in their 20s and 30s so focused on lifestyle, especially traveling. And that's nice if you can afford it. But if your friends all want to go to Miami for the weekend, and the only way you can go is put it all on your credit card and then pay the minimum balance, you can't afford to go to Miami. So don't go. And then let me address one other trend when it comes to spending. I see a lot of young women choosing to spend time with older men who are helping them out with life expenses, you know, rent, car, and also, you know, providing a lifestyle higher than they could probably afford for themselves. And that's totally fine. I don't have any problem with that. But just keep it in perspective. And the things you need to keep in perspective is, first, it's his money. It's not your money. And second, it's temporary, because unless he puts a ring on it, this is eventually going to end. So if you are in that situation and you are receiving help with your living expenses, then seize this as a saving opportunity. If you don't have to pay your own rent or your own car note, then take that money, and save it and invest it. I had an acquaintance once who was in a long-term relationship with a guy, and he was paying for everything. He paid the rent on her high-rise apartment. He paid for her, you know, luxury German vehicle. They traveled first class, stayed in high-end restaurants, and life was great. But after about 10 years, that relationship actually ended. And we were all shocked to discover she didn't have any savings. She actually had to move back in with her mom. And we were like, you've had 10 years of basically being able, and she worked, to be able to save the money you had. And she didn't look at it that way. She didn't plan long term. And then it was like 10 years of her life she couldn't get back. Okay? There's no shame in living within your means. And without it, you can't proceed to the second tier of building wealth. Okay. So I said the first part about building wealth is living below your means. And the reason that's important, so you'll have money available to save and invest. And fortunately, there's so many easy ways to do it. First of all, if your job has a 401k or its equivalent, enroll in it immediately. Many of these programs have matching funds from the employer, and that's just like free money in the street. Additionally, outside of work, there are many great resources online. There are free apps, there are investment apps, there are saving apps that are free and can not only provide you with financial education, but also help you in setting up automatic saving. The best saving is when you don't see it, you don't think about it, it happens automatically. And even if it's only $50 a month is the most you can save, it's important to get started and make that a habit. Okay? When it comes to saving and investing, the greatest advantage available to you by far is time. Time and compound interest are the key to savings and wealth growth. And just know, every investor that ever lived has the same limit. I wish I had started earlier. I wish I had saved more. Even if they started at 21, they'll wish they started at 20. Okay? And so let me kind of give you a simple illustration about the power of compound interest and how it can grow wealth. And if you need to write this down, that's fine. So I'm going to talk about two individuals, Jamie and Paul. So first, Jamie. Jamie starts investing at the age of 21. He invests $200 a month, which is $2,400 a year. And when he gets to age 30, he stops. So his total investment horizon was 9 years, and the total amount that he contributed was $21,600. Okay? That's Jamie. Paul doesn't start investing to age 30. He also is investing $200 a month or $2,400 a year. But he continues to make these investments all the way until the age of 67. Okay? So he invests for 37 years, and his total contributions was $88,000. All right? When you get to that age, at the age 67, Jamie, who only invested for 9 years, his money has grown to $2.1 million, while Paul's has only grown to $1.2 million. So the 9 years versus the 37 years delivered twice as much money. Why? Because he was in the market longer and he had that 10 years of compound interest increase that build up a lead that couldn't even be recovered with an additional 25 years of investing. That shows the power of time and compound interest. Before I get to the last part of wealth building, the investing, which we'll have discussion, I feel the need to address one other critical factor, which is particularly relevant to the Black community. And that's having children. Okay. One common refrain you'll hear from me is college isn't for everyone, marriage isn't for everyone, children isn't for everyone. You know, personally, I can't imagine how much less fulfilling my life would be if I hadn't had my sons. I mean, it's totally joy and it's greatly enriched my life. But that said, children are expensive. Actually, they're very expensive. And it's even more expensive and harder to be a single parent. The majority of Black children are married or born to unmarried parents. Now, that doesn't mean that all of them are in a single household, because there are dual parent households where the children are there and the parents aren't necessarily married, okay? And they could be living with both of their biological parents. But that said, Black mothers are far more likely to be unmarried than any other group. Specifically, white moms, 28% unmarried. Hispanic moms, 52% unmarried. Black moms, 70% are unmarried. Now, this discussion I'm having has nothing to do with morals, religion, or judgment of any kind. I'm only talking about the economic and financial impact of single parenthood. And it is a significant barrier to building wealth. Now, I recognize there's no longer a social stigma attached to single parenthood, and I actually think that is great. I've always felt that that was unfair and unnecessary. But let us not ignore that this situation is a life choice. Now, let me also recognize there are some factors that contribute to why Black moms are more likely to be single. First of all, it's the fact they do have fewer marriage opportunities due to the high incarceration rate and employment rate of Black men, in their community. Secondly, Black women are much more likely to be economically independent. Black women are the most educated and the most able financially to support themselves. So they don't have a need to get married just, to be able to live financially. And then finally, some women just choose to be single parents. All right. However, there is still a high number of unattended pregnancies. And I'm sorry, there's no reason in the 21st century for unplanned pregnancies. I mean, birth control is readily available. Use it. But whatever the reason for single parenthood, the economic facts are dual parent households have significantly higher net worth than single parent households. Single parents have lower income, fewer career growth opportunities, more debt, and lower household net worth. That's just a fact. Okay? And while the majority of single parents are women, the fathers also have adverse economic impact. Most directly is in child support. Child support obligations suppress men's ability to grow wealth. It has been the financial downfall of many professional athletes because you can't get out of it. Even if you file bankruptcy, it does not absolve you of your child support obligations. I was once in the barbershop and I was the only person in the barbershop who was not paying child support. And the reason I know, because the discussion started because one of the guys came into the barbershop and he had just come from financial court and he was complaining about the judge. And one of the things he said was, can't no white man tell me how much I have to pay to support my kids. And I said, that's exactly what he can do. That's exactly what he can do. And then there was another guy sitting next to me complaining because he had 5 kids that he was paying child support to. And I said to him, I'm unsympathetic to your problem. I am. I said, there are these things they sell in the drugstore. Sometimes they come in the packets as few as 3, and they could greatly aid in being able to prevent pregnancies. I also suggested that vasectomy might be an option or a choice. Now, I knew that wouldn't go over well because black men don't get vasectomies. In fact, less than 4% of all black men have ever had a vasectomy. And for many of them, it's too closely tied to their manhood. I heard people say, as a man, I just need to know I can make babies. I'm like, really? I think it's far more manly to be able to provide for the children that you father. Okay, so to close out the discussion on kids, the decision to have children is a personal choice. And I will never criticize people who make the choice. I deal in facts and truth, not emotion and judgment. But as it relates to wealth building, single parents have a much tougher path to building wealth than dual parents, and rich households have fewer children than poor households. Okay? Those are just facts. Okay, let's get to the last piece of wealth building, which is investing. Investing. This is actually where we see the largest difference between what happens in black households versus white households. Now, let me first say I had to be very careful here. I am a licensed financial advisor, and so by regulation, I am restricted. I'm not allowed to give advice or make financial product recommendations on this podcast, okay? However, I am allowed to provide financial education, and that's what I'll focus on here. Now, earlier in the episode, I shared an illustration of 2 different investors and the power of compound interest. I compared the wealth gains of their approach, but the point I was making was time in the market. Well, another key element to those results were the returns that they were getting on the investment. That illustration assumed they were each getting about 11% return, which is actually lower than the average return of the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is the stock index that includes the 500 largest publicly traded companies in the United States, and is generally considered the best indication of stock market performance. It's very difficult to achieve double-digit growth from your investment portfolio unless your portfolio includes high return assets, which usually means stocks or equities. And when I say that, I'm talking large stocks, small stocks, middle-sized stocks, international stocks, okay? Investing is the key to building generational wealth, because stocks tend to appreciate more quickly than other kinds of investments, even housing equity, which is a large part of the net worth of many Black households. But as the adage says, high reward does carry higher risk. And this is why Black households achieve far smaller growth from their investments. Black investors, Black households are generally conservative investors, far more likely to invest their money in safer assets like CDs, bonds, money market accounts. And while these investments are unlikely to have great losses in principal, they also are only going to generate gains in the mid-single digit range. And this disparity in investment behavior is not because of income. Because even if you normalize for age, income, education, geography, if you have all those things the same, the white household is going to have wealth gains more than double the Black household because of the difference in investment choices. Specifically, if you look at the portfolios, stock equity makes up about 30% of white wealth, but only 4% of the wealth in Black households. Now, part of this mindset is a little understandable. Black people are typically wary and skeptical of large institutions, especially in the financial sector. And we have reason to be skeptical given some of the atrocities and the histories that have come out of those sectors. So I get that. But I'll only make this point. Over the long term, the stock market is a high return, low to marginal risk investment choice. And when I say long term, I mean 10 years. You can pick any date on the calendar since 1925, okay? And look at that same date 10 years later, and the stock market will be up, okay? I want to emphasize the stock market is a long-term investment vehicle. Because in the short term, there can be volatility, there can be some highs, there can be some lows, but over a long period of time, that volatility smooths out. So I encourage all of you to take steps to increase your financial education. If you choose not to work with a financial advisor, which is the choice most people make, there's still many other resources available to you to increase your financial knowledge. There are apps, there are articles, there are financial shows, or you could just talk with someone that you know and you trust for them being knowledgeable in, finances and money. When I was young, I had an uncle who had a lot of financial success, and I would talk to him as a resource in addition to other things I may look at as books. Okay. But however you choose to proceed, there are many ways available to you, and I encourage you to get smarter when it comes to money and investment. So to close, you have a lot of control over your ability to build wealth. And with these choices in your control, racism cannot take those choices or control away from you. What you need to do, spend less, save more, invest wisely. These are all choices within your control. Just choose wisely. That's all I have today for The Ruthless Truth. Be sure to engage on Instagram at TruthDavis5 or at TruthDavis.com, and Ruthless Truth on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.